Welcome to Creole Heritage Month. Now, let's talk about what that actually means. So, you saw a graphic on Instagram. It's October, and somewhere between the pumpkin spice lattes and the premature Christmas decorations, a vibrant post with a fleur-de-lis and some colorful flags told you it was Happy Creole Heritage Month. It was probably posted by a praline company, a tourism board, or maybe even your cousin from Lafayette who makes a mean gumbo. And you thought, cool, I like Creole food, I like Zydeco music, happy Creole Heritage Month. But let's be clear. What exactly are we celebrating? Are we celebrating a race? A language? A type of seasoning? Is it Beyoncé's ancestry or the reason New Orleans food tastes like a gift from God? The answer, for most people, is a confused shrug. And that confusion isn't an accident. It's the result of a centuries-long project to take one of America's most unique and complex cultural identities and jam it into a simple, brutal, and fundamentally American box. The history of the word Creole is the story of America's obsession with race, specifically its need to enforce a rigid binary of black and white on a culture that was, by its very nature, a beautiful, swirling, multilingual, multi-ethnic masterpiece of defiance. To understand Creole, you have to start with the word itself. It doesn't come from a place or a people. It comes from an idea. The term traces its roots back to the Latin verb creare, meaning to produce, create. Through Portuguese and Spanish, it came to mean something very specific in the colonial cauldron of the New World, born here. It was a geographic marker, not a racial one. It was a simple, elegant way to distinguish people and things native to the colonies from the people and things that had just gotten off the boat from the Old World, be it Europe or Africa. This series of essays is about reclaiming that original meaning and tracing its deliberate corruption. We're going to un-whitewash the history of a people who built a world for themselves out of the collision of continents. We will explore how Creolite, the state of being Creole, was an act of creation in the face of destruction. And most importantly, we will understand that from the moment the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, to be Creole was, in essence, anti-American. The established, Latin-based, French-speaking Catholic Society of Louisiana stood in direct opposition to the new English-speaking Protestant Anglo-American culture that came flooding in. The newcomers brought with them a different language, a different religion, and a far more simplistic and violent understanding of race. In the face of this cultural invasion, identifying as Creole became an act of resistance. It was a declaration that our way of life, our language, our food, and our understanding of family and community will not be erased by your narrow definitions. This wasn't just a preference, it was a political statement. So, welcome to Creole Heritage Month. Let's talk about what that actually means. Essay 1, Creole 101. Unpacking America's most deliberately misunderstood word. Before America got its hands on the word Creole, it was a global concept, a straightforward descriptor for a new reality forged in the fires of colonialism. But in the United States, and specifically in Louisiana, that simple word became a battleground for identity, a tool of oppression, and ultimately a reclaimed badge of honor. To understand Creole history is to understand how a word can be weaponized and how a people can fight to take it back. In the beginning, it was about where you were from, not who you were. First, let's get one thing straight. Louisiana does not have a monopoly on Creole culture. The Creole experience is a worldwide phenomenon, a shared story of cultural collision and creation that stretches from the Caribbean islands of Haiti, Martinique, and St. Lucia to the Indian Ocean nations of Réunion and Seychelles, and across the African continent in places like Cape Verde. All these places share a history of European colonialism, the mass displacement of African peoples, and interaction with indigenous populations, resulting in new languages, new foods, new music, and new peoples. Louisiana is just one branch of this massive global family tree. In its earliest Louisiana usage, the term was beautifully, radically simple. A Creole was someone born in the Louisiana colony. That's it. It wasn't about race, skin color, or blood quantum. It was about place. A person of French or Spanish descent born in New Orleans was a Creole, distinguishing them from an immigrant newly arrived from Paris or Madrid. A person of African descent born on a Louisiana plantation was a Creole, distinguishing them from someone who had been stolen from West Africa and forced to endure the Middle Passage. The term described a shared experience of being native to this new, often brutal, but uniquely blended world. It signified a common ground, a shared birthplace that transcended the rigid racial lines that would come to define America. The Americanization of everything, including people. Everything changed in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just the largest real estate deal in history. For the people of Louisiana, it was a cultural invasion. The arrival of hordes of Anglo-Americans introduced a foreign and brutally simplistic racial logic into a society that had, for all its faults, operated with a more complex and fluid social structure. These newcomers, products of an English-speaking Protestant culture, were baffled by Louisiana's three-tiered society of whites, enslaved people, and a large, often prosperous class of gens de couleur libre, free people of color. To make sense of it, they did what America always does. They flattened it. They imposed their rigid binary system of race onto this new territory. And in the process, they hijacked the word Creole. Unfamiliar with its geographic meaning, they began to associate it exclusively with people of mixed race ancestry. The term was twisted from an identifier of place into an identifier of race, a convenient label that helped the new Anglo power structure sort people into the only two boxes they understood, white and not white. This forced a crisis of identity. White Creoles, seeking to preserve their privileged status, began to frantically emphasize their pure European lineage, sometimes insisting that they were the only true Creoles. Meanwhile, the Creoles of color, who had carved out a unique social and economic space for themselves, owning property, receiving formal educations, and working as skilled artisans, found themselves being violently shoved down the racial ladder. The new Anglo regime sought to erase their distinct identity and lump them in with all other people of African descent, regardless of their history, language, or status. This redefinition was not a simple linguistic misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of social and political engineering. The American system of Jim Crow, which was already taking root, required a clear, unambiguous line between the races. A powerful, educated, property-owning class of mixed-race people was a direct threat to that system. You cannot easily enforce a binary racial order on a society that has a thriving, established third group. By legally and socially erasing the distinct identity of Creoles of color, by weaponizing the very word they used to describe themselves, the Anglo power structure cleared the way for the legal framework of segregation that would dominate the South for the next century. The war over the word Creole was the first battle of Jim Crow in Louisiana. So, what is Creole today? After more than 200 years of being twisted, weaponized, and reclaimed, what does Creole mean now? It has evolved once more. Today, Creole is best understood not as a race, but as a cultural identity. It is a proud declaration of heritage that connects people of all backgrounds, white, black, and mixed race, to their shared colonial Louisiana roots. It is a culture defined by its tangible expressions, its food, its music, its family traditions, and its unique languages, like the French-based Creole language known as cuisine. Think of it like a pot of gumbo. Creole culture is the pot itself, a vessel forged in Louisiana that holds the rich ingredients and culinary knowledge of West Africa, the indigenous Americas, and Western Europe. What comes out of that pot is something entirely new, a complex and delicious synthesis that is more than the sum of its parts. It is uniquely, defiantly, and unapologetically Creole. The definition of Creole has been a moving target, deliberately shifted over the centuries to serve different political and social agendas. In the colonial era before 1803, the meaning was simple and non-racial. It meant born in the colony. This was a geographic distinction made by the French and Spanish administrations to separate those native to Louisiana from new arrivals, creating a multi-tiered society that included a distinct class of free people of color. This changed dramatically in the early American era, from the Louisiana Purchase through the Civil War. The influx of Anglo-Americans brought a new racial logic. White Creoles began using the term to mean descendant of French-Spanish settlers to distinguish themselves from the newcomers, while the term was also used to identify the free people of color. This period marked the beginning of the word's racialization, as identifying as Creole became a way to preserve a unique culture and social status in the face of American expansion. The Jim Crow era after Reconstruction saw the most violent redefinition. Driven by a white supremacist backlash and codified by laws like the Separate Car Act, the state imposed a new definition. Creole now meant anyone with one drop of African blood. This was a legal and social maneuver designed to erase the unique identity of Creoles of color, forcing them into a rigid black-white binary to make segregation easier to enforce. Finally, in the contemporary era, the term has been reclaimed. Fueled by cultural revival movements and celebrations like Creole Heritage Month, Creole is now understood as a cultural identity rooted in a shared Louisiana heritage. It celebrates a multiracial, multi-ethnic culture defined by its unique food, music, and history, returning the focus to a shared creation rather than an imposed racial category. Essay 2. The Gumbo Pot and the Praline Hustle, A People's History of Creole Cuisine. If you want to understand the soul of Creole culture, you have to understand the food. But the stories we're told about Creole cuisine are often just as whitewashed as the history of the people who created it. We're fed romantic fables of French aristocrats and their refined city food, a narrative that conveniently erases the Black and indigenous genius at the heart of the tradition. The truth is that Creole cuisine is a story of survival, innovation, and entrepreneurship. It was born in the brutal reality of the plantation and perfected in the bustling streets of New Orleans by enslaved and free people of color who brilliantly synthesized the knowledge of 3 continents. The Praline Papers, how an energy bar for the enslaved became a New Orleans hustle. Let's start with the praline, that iconic New Orleans confection. The official story, the one you'll find in tourist shops and glossy cookbooks, credits the candy to the chef of a 17th century French diplomat, the Duke of Plessy's Porcelain. It's a cute story about coating almonds in sugar for a nobleman. It's also almost certainly a lie, or to be more precise, a deliberate fable designed to give a European pedigree to a thoroughly American and thoroughly Black invention. The evidence points not to a French palace, but to the sweltering sugar plantations of Louisiana as the true birthplace of the pecan praline. Here, the primary cooks were enslaved African Americans. They possessed the deep ancestral knowledge of how to process sugarcane, a skill essential to the plantation economy. They foraged for native pecans to supplement their meager rations, and they combined the master sugar with the native land's nuts to create a flat, nutrient-dense patty, a 19th century energy bar designed to power their bodies through the grueling labor of the fields and mills. They even had their own name for it, praline, derived from the French word plat, meaning flat, a name that speaks to its practical, unpretentious origins. After the Civil War, the praline became a vehicle for Black economic independence. Emancipated African American women, known as pralinières or marchandes, carried this knowledge to New Orleans. They cooked pralines in their own kitchens and sold them in the streets of the French Quarter, turning a symbol of plantation survival into a tool of entrepreneurship. These women were more than just candy sellers. They were business owners in an era when Black women had almost no paths to economic power. During the city's frequent and terrifying yellow fever epidemics, when others fled or hid, these marchandes braved the plague-ridden streets to sell their wares, becoming a literal lifeline for the city's residents. The praline hustle wasn't just about making candy, it was about building a life. Gumbo is a verb, deconstructing the official state dish. If the praline is a story of ingenuity, gumbo is the edible embodiment of the Creole identity itself. It is the perfect metaphor for a culture created from a blend of diverse elements. Gumbo is not just a dish. It's a process of synthesis, a culinary conversation between Africa, Europe, and the Americas that has been simmering for centuries. The very foundation of the dish is African. The name gumbo derives from kingombo, a word for okra in several West African Bantu languages. Okra, brought to Louisiana by enslaved Africans, was the original thickener for the stew, a direct transplant of African culinary technology. The concept of the one-pot stew, a hearty, communal meal cooked low and slow, is also a hallmark of West African cuisine. The second key ingredient comes from the indigenous people of Louisiana. The Choctaw and other tribes contributed their knowledge of the local flora, specifically the use of filet powder, dried and ground sassafras leaves, as both a thickener and a distinctive earthy flavoring agent. When okra was out of season, filet was the go-to alternative, a testament to the adaptation and exchange that defined early Creole life. Finally, the European contribution is the roux. While the technique of cooking flour and fat together as a base comes from French cuisine, Creole cooks transformed it. Instead of a pale, blonde roux used in classical French cooking, Creole cooks brown their roux slowly, sometimes to the color of dark chocolate, creating a deep, nutty, and complex flavor that is the unmistakable soul of a good gumbo. This process of culinary creolization is repeated in other iconic dishes, like jambalaya. The dish was born when Spanish colonists, attempting to recreate their native paella, substituted local ingredients like tomatoes for unavailable saffron. They combined this with the French trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper, a descendant of Mirepoix, and the rice cultivation knowledge brought by West Africans, creating another uniquely Creole dish. Every pot of gumbo, every praline sold by a marchandess tells a hidden story. In a system designed to strip enslaved people of their culture, language, and history, the kitchen became a secret archive. Foodways were a hidden transcript, a powerful and resilient form of cultural memory. The use of okra was a direct link to an African past. The knowledge of filet was an acknowledgement of an indigenous present. The creation of the praline was an act of agency, using the tools of the oppressor to ensure one's own survival. When the praliniers turned that knowledge into a business, they transformed a hidden transcript of survival into a public declaration of economic resistance. Creole food is not just delicious. It is a living testament to the knowledge, resilience, and defiant creativity of its true creators. Essay 3. The Soundtrack of Survival: How Creoles Invented American Music, Twice. The history of American music, as it's usually told, is a story of neat, separate boxes. Blues here, country there, jazz over yonder. But the real story is much messier, and at the center of that beautiful mess are the Creole people of Louisiana. In the span of a few decades, the unique social and cultural pressures they faced became the unintentional catalyst for two of the most vital and influential forms of American music. White supremacy, in its relentless effort to control and categorize Black life, accidentally created the conditions for a cultural revolution. Twice. From Lala to Le Hericos, the birth of Zydeco. Long before the electric guitars and shimmering washboard vests, there was Lala. This was the raw, acoustic folk music of the rural Black Creoles of southwest Louisiana in the 1920s. Played at house dances and community gatherings, it was a stripped-down sound, typically featuring just an accordion and a fiddle, that formed the bedrock of what was to come. The godfather of this sound was a man named Amédée Ardoin, a legendary accordionist and singer. Ardoin was the first to make seminal recordings of this music between 1929 and 1934, creating a style that blended Black Creole rhythms with the waltzes and two-steps of his white Cajun neighbors. He was the wellspring, the source from which the entire genre would flow. The music underwent a radical transformation in the 1940s and 50s. Driven by economic hardship, thousands of Black Creoles left rural Louisiana to find work in the booming industrial cities of southeast Texas, like Houston and Beaumont. In segregated neighborhoods like Houston's Fifth Ward, which became known as Frenchtown, a powerful new sound was forged. Here, the old-time la-la music collided with the raw electric energy of urban blues and R&B. The acoustic accordion was joined by electric guitars, drums, and the iconic corrugated metal washboard, or fauteuil, played as a percussion instrument. This new, amplified, and intensely danceable music needed a name, and it found one in a common Creole folk lyric: Les haricots sont pas salés. In English, the snap beans aren't salty. It was a simple phrase that spoke volumes about poverty and hard times. Things were so tough, there wasn't even any salt pork to season the beans. In the swift, slurred pronunciation of Louisiana Creole French, Les haricots came out sounding like Zydeco. The name stuck, forever linking this vibrant, joyous music to the everyday struggles of the people who created it. The unwilling marriage that birthed jazz. While Zydeco was being born in the countryside in Texas boomtowns, a different musical revolution was brewing in the complex social world of New Orleans. At the end of the 19th century, the city was home to two distinct Black musical cultures that existed in parallel but rarely intersected. First were the downtown Creoles of color. This community, which had a long history of freedom before the Civil War, placed a high value on European cultural traditions. Their musicians were often formally educated, some even studying in France. They could read complex music scores, played in sophisticated orchestras, and prized technical skill and discipline. They were, in many ways, the city's musical elite. Then there were the uptown Black Americans, many of whom were just a generation or two removed from slavery. Their musical world was not one of written scores and formal training, but of raw, powerful emotion and improvisation. It was a world steeped in the gut-wrenching feeling of the blues, the call and response of spirituals, and the infectious, syncopated rhythms of ragtime. Theirs was an oral tradition, passed down in social halls and on street corners. These two worlds were forced to collide by an act of pure legislative racism. In 1894, the Louisiana legislature passed a series of segregationist laws, sometimes called the White Act, which effectively stripped the Creoles of color of their unique in-between social status and legally reclassified them as simply black. Suddenly, the classically trained Creole musicians were kicked out of the concert halls and upscale venues where they had made their living. To find work, they were forced into the less formal, more improvisational world of the uptown musicians, a world they had often looked down upon. It was a shotgun wedding orchestrated by white supremacy. And from this forced union, a new child was born. The harmonic complexity and technical virtuosity of the Creole tradition fused with the raw, blues-drenched improvisatory fire of the uptown tradition. This musical gumbo, this explosive synthesis of structure and soul, was the birth of jazz. The very laws designed to enforce a rigid racial hierarchy inadvertently created the perfect conditions for a cultural revolution that would change the world. Segregation built the walls of the laboratory, and within it, Creole musicians became the architects of America's greatest art form. Essay 4. The People v. the One-Drop Rule. The Creole Masterminds Behind Plessy v. Ferguson. The story of Plessy v. Ferguson, as taught in every American history class, is a tragedy. It's the story of a devastating loss, the 1896 Supreme Court decision that gave a constitutional stamp of approval to racial segregation and unleashed the horror of separate but equal upon the nation for more than half a century. And while the outcome was undeniably tragic, focusing only on the loss misses the real story. The real story is one of brilliant, audacious, and radical legal activism. It's the story of a committee of Creole intellectuals in New Orleans who, facing the rising tide of Jim Crow, didn't just file a lawsuit. They staged a piece of political theater so profound that it was designed to expose the very concept of race in America as a legal and logical fraud. They lost the case, but their strategy laid bare the absurd foundations of white supremacy. The brains of the operation, the Comité des Citoyens. The fight began in 1890 when Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, mandating segregated railway coaches. In response, a group of New Orleans' most prominent Black, white, and Creole of color citizens formed the Comité des Citoyens, the Citizens Committee, led by figures like the author Rudolph Destunis and the newspaper publisher Louis Martinet. This was no ragtag group of protesters. They were educated, strategic, and deeply committed to fighting the creeping advance of Jim Crow. Their goal was far more ambitious than simply integrating train cars. They sought to challenge the state's fundamental authority to classify its citizens by race and, on the basis of that arbitrary classification, strip them of their rights. They saw the Separate Car Act for what it was, the legal erasure of the complex, multi-tiered Creole society and the imposition of America's brutal one-drop rule. The perfect plaintiff, the perfect crime. The committee's strategy was nothing short of genius, and it all hinged on their choice of plaintiff, a 30-year-old shoemaker named Homer Plessy. Plessy was, in the racial calculus of the time, an Octoran, meaning he had one African great-grandparent. But crucially, as the court records themselves stated, his African ancestry was not discernible in him. Homer Plessy looked white. He could, and regularly did, pass for white. This was not a coincidence. It was the entire point. On June 7, 1892, the committee set their plan in motion. This was not a spontaneous act of defiance. It was a meticulously staged event. They informed the East Louisiana Railroad of their intentions. The railroad, it should be noted, opposed the law because it was expensive to maintain extra cars. They hired a private detective with arresting powers to be on the train, ensuring that Plessy would be charged with violating the Separate Car Act, not with the lesser crime of disturbing the peace. Plessy bought a first-class ticket and took a seat in the whites-only car. When the conductor challenged him, Plessy revealed his racial background and refused to move. He was promptly arrested, just as planned. The trap was set. The committee had created a perfect test case, forcing the state of Louisiana to arrest a man for being black who, by all visual evidence, was white. The argument you never heard in history class. The legal battle that followed was a direct assault on the twisted logic of American racial classification. Plessy's lawyers, led by Albion Torgy, argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. But their most radical and innovative argument went far further. They contended that the law had deprived Plessy of his property without due process of law. What property? The reputation of being a white man. The argument was this: in American society, whiteness is not just a classification. It is a form of property, an asset that grants its owner access to privileges, opportunities, and social standing. Since Homer Plessy appeared to be white, the state, by forcing a conductor to label him colored and eject him from the white car, was arbitrarily stripping him of this valuable property. This brilliant legal maneuver forced the courts to confront the tangible, monetary value of a racial category that white supremacy claimed was natural and God-given. The committee was posing a devastating question to the highest court in the land. How can the law enforce a distinction between races when that distinction is in fact invisible? Who gives the state the right to look at a man like Homer Plessy and assign him an identity, stripping him of his rights in the process? This was not just a case about segregation. It was a case about the fundamental right to self-identification against the tyranny of a state-imposed racial caste system. The Comité des Citoyens had fought for the right to be seen as they saw themselves. The Supreme Court answered that the state, and the state alone, gets to decide who you are. Conclusion. Journée Creole is every day. The celebration of Creole Heritage Month in Louisiana is part of a much larger global movement of cultural preservation. The formal holiday, International Creole Day, or Journée Creole, Creole Day, was established on October 28, 1983, by Creole-speaking communities in the Caribbean, particularly St. Lucia and Dominica. It was born from a desire to uplift and defend Creole languages and cultures that were often marginalized and dismissed as mere patois. This global context reminds us that the Creole story in Louisiana is a local chapter in an international epic of resilience. From the un-whitewashed history of the praline to the defiant rhythms of Zydeco and Jazz, and from the brilliant legal strategy of the Comité des Citoyens to the very meaning of the word itself, the story of the Creole people is a masterclass in survival. It is a story of creating a vibrant, enduring culture in the crucible of colonialism and slavery. It is the story of forging a unique identity in the face of a relentless campaign of erasure. It is the story of building a world on one's own terms, with its own food, its own music, and its own rules. The contributions of Creole people are not relics to be admired in a museum. They are living, breathing traditions that have profoundly shaped American culture.
To celebrate Creole heritage is to do more than just eat a good meal or dance to a good song. It is to celebrate the defiant, creative, and world-building spirit that refused to be categorized, refused to be silenced, and refused to be erased. It is the spirit that in so many ways represents the un-whitewashed soul of America itself. This history is and always has been Creole AF.